was one of the largest empires in history. And of course, that empire preceded the Islamic empire, which emerged subsequently with the foundation of the religion of Islam at the beginning of the 7th century. And the Persian Empire was a major rival to a number of other empires and a successor to a number of other empires. But in the end, of course, like all empires, Persian Empire went down the same path in the sense that faced problems of overstretch and problems of governance from the center and problem of controlling the peripheries, and therefore the Persian Empire also shrank. But the core of the Persian Empire remained as the homeland of the Persian people of the Parsi origins, and that is what is called Iran today. When we say Persian, we don't automatically mean Islamic, because the Persian people and the Persian Empire existed well before the foundation of Islam at the beginning of the 7th century. It was not until the end of the 7th century and the beginning of the 8th century that Islam succeeded in conquering Persia. Prior to that, Persians had their own civilization, their own Zoroastrian religion, and their own culture. That's not to say that Islam totally Islamicized the Persian culture and the Persian landscape, but it did succeed in implanting the Islamic system of belief and values and practices among the Persians, who embraced it in many ways very willingly. But it is only since the beginning of the 16th century that Shiite Islam, the Shiite sect of Islam, was adopted as the official religion of Iran, and that was initiated by the Safavid dynasty in the country. And Iran remains a predominantly Shiite Muslim state to the present day. The Persian Empire originally was multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, and for that reason also not culturally homogenized. But the dominant force were the Farsi speakers, who remains the dominant force to the present day. When Islam came to Persia, on the one hand, Islam Islamized many aspects of Persian life and culture. But in some other ways, also the Persian culture and society influenced certain aspects of Islam. So it was essentially a dialectic process. In fact, for example, the Islamic rulers, the Arab Islamic rulers, they learned a great deal from the Persians, particularly in the field of administration, governance, and a number of other things. And of course, Persia, even prior to the arrival of Islam, had its own cultural centers, some of the best libraries in the world. The Jand-Shahpur Library was one of the most important center of cultural renaissance in Old Persia. So the Persians' interaction with Islam, in many ways, have been a dialectic one, but Islam has been embraced, and more specifically, the Shiite sect of Islam, from the beginning of the 16th century, as the dominant religion in Iran. The origins of this Sunni Shiite divide in Islam really goes back to the early days of Islam. It essentially emanated from a dispute over the leadership of the Muslim community after the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632. there were a group of Muslims who argued that it is important that the leadership of the Islamic community remains in the hands of the household of the Prophet. And the most prominent member, or one of the most prominent member of the Prophet's entourage and companion, was Ali, the fourth Caliph of Islam, who was also the son-in-law and the cousin of the Prophet. This group, which dissented from the majority view, which had been adopted, that the Prophet should be succeeded by his four companions in the order of seniority, and argued that Ali, who is supposed to be the fourth successor of the Prophet, should be the true successor of the Prophet. And of course, that was rejected by a majority of Muslims. But those who supported Ali as the true successor of the Prophet's, not his prophecy, but his political and community leadership, emerged as a group in its own right. Initially, it was an underground movement, but over a period of time, the Shiites emerged as an important sect and an important force in the Muslim world. And they were accommodated by the Sunnis, who form the majority of people in the Muslim domain today. But the Shiites also form the majority in today's Iran, Iraq, and Azerbaijan, although Azerbaijan has been secularized because of the 70 years of Soviet rule, and also the citizens of Bahrain form a majority. They are Shiites. But the rest of the Muslim world is dominated by the Sunnis, but there are substantial Shiite minorities in other parts of the Muslim world as well. For example, in the case of Afghanistan, something like 15 to 20% of the population is made up of Shiites. And the same is true in the case of Pakistan. And there are also Shiite minorities in Muslim countries in North Africa and in the Middle East as a whole. Well, the Persian Empire initially was that after it was Islamized, it was predominantly a Sunni empire, and therefore a Sunni dominated country. But it was only from the sort of 16th century when Shiite Islam really took off, and also the Persians want to distinguish themselves from Arabs in many ways, and wanted to defend themselves against the Sunni-dominated Ottoman Empire, that they adopted Shiite Islam as the official religion of the state. At the doctrinal level, there is not a lot of difference between them. There are some differences, but not a lot of differences. But at the practical level, there are some differences, some important differences. The Shiites, for example, are historically been led by an imam, which is because the Shiites came into existence as Protestants of Islam, or as the heterodox in Islam. And because they were originally rejected by the Sunnis, they became an underground movement, and they adopted their own system of leadership. After the emergence of Islam, the Muslim world was subjected not only to division between the Sunni sect and the Shia sect, but also many subsects, and a number of movements emerged. And one of those movements was the Sufi movement, which adopted an alternative method of worshipping God. Whereas in Orthodox Islam, music, dancing, ecstasy, chanting were shunned, the Sufi movement adopted all these in terms of achieving reunion with God. They adopted music, chanting, ecstasy, and so on. And they also try to see God in everything and see God in their own hearts, and also see a direct reunion between them and God. And as a result of that, what emerged was a number of Sufi or mystics movements in Islam. And these movements, over a period of time, influenced the thinking and practices of many Muslims, particularly at the times when established Islam was in a weaker position, which really becomes apparent from the 10th century afterwards. Then it is the Sufi movements in Islam which carries the flag of Islam to different parts of the world, particularly to Central Asia, to Southeast Asia. And we have these Sufi movements still very much alive and active in many parts of the Muslim world.
That's very interesting.
Imagery presented in the exhibition of Love and Devotion can be rejected by some radical Islamists who would not want to see Islam or the history of Islam portrayed in the form of images. For example, a group like the Taliban in Afghanistan had banned any form of imagery and any form of the depiction of, for example, Muslim leaders or Muslim personalities and so on. But this is a very small minority in the Muslim world. The majority of Muslims are not against imagery, as long as those imageries do not represent a depiction of the Prophet or certain companions of the Prophet and those who are upheld by Muslims as important saints in Islam. But otherwise, imagery has become something accepted and embraced by many Muslims. And some of the imageries that you see in this exhibition, they are not something which could reflect either on the Prophet of Islam or on the companions of Islam. They are more in terms of depicting the culture and historical events and movements and motions and part of the Muslim world that is what Iran or what was used to be called Persia. Poetry and art really go to the heart of the Persian culture. It has been the major means of communications between Persians, or what's today called Iranians, and their Western counterparts, and also, for that matter, their Eastern counterparts. Iranian culture revolves very much around important romantic symbols and revolves around important literary symbols. And these have been important motivations in terms of producing, enabling the old Persia, today's Iran, to produce some of the best poets in the history and some of the best artists, for the matter, in history. And for example, Saadi, Hafiz, these are some of the very big names of poets in Persia. And they have made very substantial contribution to the development of poetry as part of the Persian culture and as part of the Persian way of life. And that in turn has also influenced the Persian music and Persian way of people actually drowning themselves into world of literature and world of cultural understanding. If we define Persia in its historical terms, no, it does not exist, because it used to be a fairly substantial empire. But today's Iran is a nation state. It is one of the units and the building blocks of the international order. And therefore, to talk about Persia, that could cause confusion in the minds of those who think of Persia in terms of the Persian Empire. And today's Iran is the heart of that Persian Empire, but not the whole of that empire. Therefore, in order to avoid confusion, it is important not to talk about so much Persia, but rather Iran. But that is not to say that we cannot talk about Persian culture, Persian art, Persian history. Yes, because today's Iran is the inheritor of all those. Persian is a state of mind in the sense that it is the crucible of the Persian identity, of the Iranian identity, Iranian culture, Iranian history, and so on. And so it does have influence. It does have influence on the psyche and the thinking of the Iranian people. But when I said that probably it's better to avoid the use of Persia in terms of defining today's Iran, is because that we don't want to cause confusion in the minds of those who always associate Persia with the old Persian Empire rather than the modern Iran. There is link between Persian art and culture and Persia's relationship with the Western world. The Persian art and cultures have had a distinguished influence on the Western thinking and Western art and Western culture. But also, it has not been a one-way traffic all the time. There has been also influences from the West, from Europe, on the Persian culture, Persian art, and for that matter, Persian poetry. There is, for example, until recently, the diplomatic language in Iran was French. And French words have been able to penetrate the Iranian or the Farsi language or the Iranian language. For example, the Iranians do not, for waiter, say garçon, not necessarily khidmatgar, which is supposed to be a Persian word. And there are so many of these which you would find in the Persian language. Iranians very commonly use the word merci, which is a French word. They do have a substitute for it, a Persian substitute for it, but it has become very common to say merci in Iran. So there has been close links and mutual influences between Iranian culture and the Western world, and particularly Europe. We know in the West a great deal about Persian art, and we know about a great deal about Persian poetry and Persian poets, and they have served as Persia's ambassador to the outside world, and most importantly in Europe. We know more about Persian art and poetry than we know actually about Persian history, or we know much about the physical landscape of Persia. What we do know about Persia, which is given us a very romantic view of Persia, is more through Persian art and poetry. And that is what is also underlines the degree of romanticism that we really have about Persia.
Is it a healthy dose of romanticism, or is it unhealthy in your view? How do you see this?
No, it is a very healthy and energizing dose to have this romanticism about Persia, because the Persians have historically exhibited a degree of romanticism in their culture, which has made their culture in many ways very unique, and also in many ways re-energizing and presenting Persia to the outside world, not as a sort of a sad place, not as a place where religions have dominated the landscape, but more as a sort of a happy place. I mean, if you look at some of the Persian poetries and talking about wine, but more in a divine sense. And they talk about love and happiness. That helps us to understand that what has transpired in Iran since the revolution of 1978-79 is not what Iran, or for that matter Persia, has always been. You know, Persia has gone through different phases of change and development, and there have been Persia, which has been the cradle of civilization and culture, literature, poetry, and also love and happiness. That's not to say that this is all gone since the revolution of 1978-79, which delivered the Iranians an Islamic government. And that Islamic government has sought to Islamicize both the culture and society to the extent which is really possible. But it is very important to note that even since the revolution or the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Islamic government in Iran, many Iranians, including the Iranian state, have actually really gone back to the history of Persia, and they have not ignored the pre-Islamic history of Persia. And some of the relics of that pre-Islamic history and culture of Persia once again have found their way into the fabrics of the Iranian society. And they are on display, and they are on exhibition, and they are reflected in the people's thinking and behavior to the present day.
Very good. Thank you.